Yeah. Like let's go around and test this. And so they come in for like this is our background. Actually, you have 2 seconds. Look at that.
Good evening. Well, that worked remarkably well. Thank you all for being here tonight. I hope that your tummies are well fed, and we trust that your minds and your hearts and your spirit will be equally well fed with this panel. On behalf of Brite Divinity School, thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you the panel for being here tonight. The topic tonight is the foreigner among us. We are grateful for your presence and your willingness to engage a topic that is both timeless in scripture and is urgent in our world today. Tonight's conversation invites us to reflect theologically and ethically on what it means to encounter the foreigner among us, not as an abstract issue, but as neighbors whose lives intersect with our own. My hope is that this dialogue will deepen our understanding, challenge our assumptions, and help us imagine faithful responses rooted in love, justice, and hospitality. I will be introducing Sandy, and she will have the honor of introducing at some point the remaining panelists. And so once I introduce Sandy, I will pass the baton on to her, and she can continue with the program. Sandy Ovalle is a table setter, a practicing poet, and a faith-rooted organizer. She is the founder of Coyo Strategies, where she helps teams create advocacy and training campaigns. She formerly served as Senior Director of Campaigns and Mobilizing at Sojourners. Sandy is committed to pro-social systemic change and believes in hearkening ancestral wisdom for our collective liberation. A native of New Mexico, she loves gathering neighbors and strangers around homemade pozole. I hope to make it to the one day. On a personal note, I met Sandy and Alexia at a conference in Puerto Rico almost 7 years ago. When I began conceiving of this event on immigration, Sandy immediately came to mind. And that's because when we met, the lasting memory that I have of her, the thing that stuck with me the most about Sandy was her commitment to immigrants. So thank you, Sandy, for accepting the invitation, and pass along the baton so that you can introduce our other speakers, who are Cintia Aguilar, Molina, Alexia Salvatierra, and Sandy will tell us a little bit more about each of them. And so please, let's give a bright welcome to our guests.
Everyone is welcome for pozole at the table. That is the attitude. Well, good evening. Our hearts have been heavy in the wake of the indiscriminate violence connected with immigration enforcement in Minneapolis and beyond. In the first 29 days of the year, an estimated 6 people have died in ICE custody, including Geraldo Lunas Campos, a Cuban father whose death in detention was ruled a homicide by a medical examiner. In the last few weeks, 3 U.S. citizens have been shot and killed at the hands of ICE agents. The assaults on human dignity and life and the reckless violence against communities demand our attention. In the midst of these actions, people all over the country have stepped up in solidarity. Neighbors delivering thousands of boxes of food in their neighbors' homes. Parents surrounding schools, picking up students, securing safety for children. Communities alerting each other of ICE presence and documenting what is happening. Pastors and faith leaders across traditions accompanying, singing, marching, and denouncing the cruelty before us. Tonight, we will anchor our time in the hopeful responses that the churches throughout time and during this time have had. There are important and meaningful conversations that we could have about how ideologies, including white Christian nationalism, have fueled the dehumanizing narratives and punitive practices often exhibited in immigration enforcement. And while we're not going to ignore those, we want to talk about how and why people of faith have resisted those narratives and the practices, and how they are addressing the pastoral and human crisis that changes in immigration policies, including enforcement, are causing. So among them, in this first year, the current administration has made sweeping changes to the U.S. immigration system. The Migration and Policy Institute estimates that the Trump administration has taken 500 immigration-related actions in its first year. That's compared to 472 immigration-related actions in all 4 years of its previous time. It has allowed enforcement operations in previously protected spaces like schools and hospitals and places of worship. And it has removed temporary protections for nearly 1 million of legally present immigrants, including Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, leaving them vulnerable to detention and deportation. And it has secured an unprecedented amount of funding, $170 billion over 4 years for border security and immigration enforcement. And most visibly, in its goals to deport 1 million people a year, it has deployed the National Guard to places like Chicago and Los Angeles to assist with enforcement operations, while also mobilizing thousands of ICE agents who are often masked to other cities around the country. So as a result, we have seen families being separated, people being grabbed on the streets and taken without proper processing. Children are being taken with their parents too. And others have hid for months in their homes, afraid to go grocery shopping or take their kids to school. These experiences are not completely new, and previous administrations have also had similar involvements. They've been have large deportation goals and have removed protections from people. And at the same time, it's a complex thing. The U.S. also has been a leader in some of the ways in which we practice immigration and in which we welcome people through our refugee and humanitarian programs. But what is new today is the speed and the size and the cruelty of the tactics, coupled with the blatant endorsement of racial profiling and the promise impunity for those who act outside the law. Churches have found ways to respond, from accompanying people to appointments, to delivering groceries and advocating for protections. Our conversation tonight is crucial because this is a moment when we need inspiration and ideas to be able to respond faithfully to the call to treat the foreigner among us as those who were native born. Joining me are 3 colleagues who are at the front of accompanying immigrant communities. The Reverend Dr. Alexia Salvatierra is the academic dean of Centro Latino at Fuller Theological Seminary. She began her work in the immigration sanctuary movement back in the 80s and is affectionately known as Madrina or Godmother in many of our communities for her deep guidance and wisdom throughout. Attorney Jorge Molina is the founder and manager of the J. Molina Law Firm right here in Fort Worth, a board-certified immigration lawyer and member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. But most importantly, un abogado de la comunidad, a community advocate that works in partnership with faith communities in the area. And Cintia Aguilar is the immigration ministry manager at FaithWorks. And she's done such a good job. She's brought audiences all the way from Nacogdoches to be here with us tonight. With a background in social work, she walks alongside congregations as they discern how to create or expand immigration ministries through a cohort model with FaithWorks. And so tonight, Attorney Jorge Molina will begin our time by setting a little bit of the situation analysis of what is happening today. He will be followed by Dr. Alexia Salvatierra, who will be sharing about the crucial involvement of churches throughout history. And then we will hear from Cintia Aguilar, who will finish on how churches are responding today. So with that, please help me welcome our first speaker, Jorge Molina.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for that introduction, and thank you to the Brite Divinity School for inviting us here, and thank you to all of you for being here and being part of this conversation. And indeed, we want this to be a conversation with you. If you have questions for me, you know, you can save them for the Q&A, and if we don't have time, I'll happily talk to you about your individual questions. But ladies and gentlemen, rather than giving you a treatise of how the law should work, I would like to tell you how the law is indeed working, or as a matter of fact, not working at all. So as a just big picture beginning to this, here how laws dealing with people coming into countries and out of countries developed, right? We know that each country or kingdom or region controlled by some people have the right to decide who will come in and who's not allowed. That is applicable anywhere in the world. In the United States, we came together as a people and said, well, we're going to elect the Congress. We're going to pass some laws. Then Congress comes and says, you know what? We're going to pass these laws, but we're going to let the president, the executive, execute these laws with the aid and support of these offices and administrations within the executive. And by the way, because our laws are not very clear and we're not really telling you how to implement them, you have the authority to pass regulations, which will help you interpret and execute these rules. That's how it should work. Okay, so our modern immigration system started right after World War II, right? President Truman, I think, passed the first Immigration and Nationality Act in the United States. And ever since, we've been amending that and changing things here and there. And what is happening currently is not really a quote unquote change in the law, but rather a massive departure of actually following the law. Let me give you a few examples. Under the United States Constitution, we all have the right to be safe in our homes. It doesn't matter what your color of skin, where you're from, your age, your gender. It does not matter. We are all kings and queens in our homes. But not anymore. The Department of Homeland Security has told its agents that they do not need a judicial warrant to break into people's homes. That's blatantly illegal. And it doesn't matter if you're leaning to the left or to the right. If you support the Constitution, you should be against that. And we have a system in place already to avoid that issue. So that's one example. Here's another matter. And this one is a little more, it's harder to follow, but let me just simplify it as much as I can, because this does lead to another point that I want to make. And that is follow the money. But here, just bear with me for a second. In the United States, we do not believe in detaining people indefinitely without pressing charges. It doesn't matter what you did. You have a right to seek to get out unless you did something very bad. Okay, you can throw people in jail for doing bad things, but they are due a process. We're all due a process. But the numbers in immigration detention have skyrocketed because since July of 2025, the administration has said that if you enter the United States without inspection, right? You didn't have a visa, you didn't go through customs, you are not eligible for a bond hearing with an immigration judge. Now, this interpretation, quite frankly, is a silly interpretation. It goes against 30 years of precedent. It's so bizarre going to an immigration judge who for years has granted bonds in cases like this to tell you, well, I can't do it. They're not eligible. I don't have jurisdiction. And so it's not only the reinterpretation of 30 years of precedent, but rather there was a decision, class action lawsuit in California, Maldonado Bautista, that a federal district judge comes out and says, that interpretation is wrong. If you're a person who entered without inspection, you at least have the right to a hearing. So for a few weeks, we had a right to hearings again. But then the Department of Justice comes out and says, no, immigration judges, you know, that order that judge said is not applicable. So don't issue bonds. And now the question is, and inevitably, is who benefits from this? Who really does benefit from this? Follow that money. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly who's going to benefit because I'm not sure. I'm not a journalist, but I see a lot of new companies and facilities being built, rushed, to the point that not even their phone system's working. I have very young colleagues that set up phone systems a lot quicker than those companies. But that's where they're shipping people. And that is a nightmare because here's the other thing. They change you from one facility to another. They change the jurisdiction of the court to another. So it's playing catch up. So that's a second example. And here's a third example that I want to provide before I pass it on to Dr. Salvatierra. Now, I don't know if you've heard this, but it's a very common saying. You say, well, why do you just wait in line? Follow the process. Follow the rules. Well, ladies and gentlemen, even if you're following the rules, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, even if you're eligible for a green card, if you're the spouse of a United States citizen, you enter lawfully. You submitted all the paperwork. You paid the fee. They are detaining people in their interviews when they're about to get their green cards. Who does that benefit? In the same line, just a few weeks ago, they announced another ban of 75 countries that cannot lawfully enter the United States. And the pretext, and I do want to be cautious with this word, it is a pretext, was they want to prevent the withdrawal of resources or the extraction of resources of the United States. That's a pretext because we already have a system in place for that. It is called the affidavit of support. I'm not going to bore you with the details of that, but essentially, if you're, quote, extracting resources from the United States, the federal government can sue that person and get those resources back. Not only that person, but their sponsor or their joint sponsor, all of them together. So even when people are following the rules, waiting for years for their turn, the administration is just changing the rules midway. And here's another important thing. It is truly David versus Goliath sort of feel. The administration is not holding back. is not just ICE, is not only CIS, not just DHS. It's the Department of Justice, it's the Department of Homeland Security, it's the Department of State working together to achieve these goals. So where are we here? So at the end of the day, what we need to do to make sure that justice is served is to go to federal courts and present lawsuits. But not everyone can afford an attorney to do that. Not everyone has that feeling in their gut and say, you know, I want to fight no matter what. Not everyone's circumstances merit that. And what I've been seeing, frankly, and it's very sad, is that a lot of folks are saying, this is just not worth it. This is not my dream. This is a nightmare. And with that, my question for Dr. Salvatierra is the American dream still alive? And what is the role of the churches in making sure our better angels can either resurrect or keep it alive?
So actually, I have a PowerPoint because I'm going to tell you some stories, but they're complicated stories. So the PowerPoint will help. Hold on, let me pull it up. So I imagine that a number of you might recognize the scripture that I wrote up there for such a time as this. It actually doesn't match the picture. The picture would be another scripture from Matthew 25 about whatever we do to the least of these, including the stranger, we do to Jesus. But for such a time as this, in case you're not familiar with the scripture, it comes out of the book of Esther. So there is a grave injustice about to happen to the Jewish people, the people of Israel. And Esther is a Jew who has been chosen by the king to be one of his wives. And so her uncle Mordecai comes to the palace and says to her, Esther, you need to speak up for us. And she says, it's dangerous for me to do that. And he says, who knows? Maybe you are in your position for such a time as this. I think that all of us at some point listening to what our lawyer just said knows that this is a time of grave injustice. And so the question for all of us is, what are we willing to stand up? Esther was personally safe. She would put herself at risk by standing up. But she chose to stand up, and she did save her people. So what I want to tell you, the reason why they call me godmother is because I've been involved in this work since 1980. You just live long enough, you get, right? Some of you know this. But I have been part of various movements where the church has stood up and has made the difference. And so I'm just going to tell you a few of those stories to encourage you, to inspire you, perhaps. So I'm going to start by saying that in 1951, the United States was instrumental, was a leader in pulling together the world to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which included the right for refugees to be received. They came up with a definition of refugee. Remember, this was right after World War II. So we had an enormous number of people who were displaced. And so they came up with the definition of refugee, and every country in the world who signed it agreed to receive people who were running from violent persecution in their land of origin for a set of specific reasons. In 1980, we codified that in the United States very clearly. We created the Refugee Act. And the Refugee Act said that you could ask to become a refugee here in two different ways. One way is from a safe third country. You got out, you're in a refugee camp, and it's temporary, and you send all your documentation and you apply to be a refugee. The other way is because you take one step over the border and you apply for asylum. You still have to go through a process to determine whether you meet the criteria. And if you don't, you will be deported. So I have to give you that background to say that from 1982 through 1990, you had a war in actually, excuse me, let me back up. 1982 is when from 1982 to 1990, you had a civil war in El Salvador. And we were allied with El Salvador, the United States. And the reason why we were allied with El Salvador, there were 92% of the arable land in El Salvador was owned or controlled by one of 14 families since the conquest. But United Fruit had made sweetheart deals with those families to use their land and pay malnutrition wages. And the Civil War happened largely because it was a war of land reform. So we were taking the side of the families because the Dulles brothers were part of the Eisenhower administration. And so we took the side of the families. They were on the board of United Fruit, and they were one of them was the legal counsel, and they were part of very close to the Eisenhower administration. And so we took the side of El Salvador. So we decided to interpret the asylum laws to say that if somebody was coming from a country that was an enemy of the United States, if you were coming from Cuba, you could just be a ballet dancer and defect. But if you were coming from El Salvador, you had a very, very high bar in order to be able to prove that you were actually running for your life. Now, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International had extensive documentation of assassinations, of massacres, but people were still having to meet this extremely high bar when they came. So that's the background. John Fife was a Presbyterian pastor at Southside Presbyterian Church. He was in Tucson, Arizona. He was driving by the detention center and he looked up, and hanging on the barbed wire, there was a sheet. And on the sheet was written in blood in Spanish, "For the love of God, help us." And so he entered, he's a 6-foot-tall white cowboy. He bullied his way right in there. And he talked to the people and he said, "Let's get you out. This is crazy." They told him the story of what was happening. And he said, "No, we're going to get you out." Whereupon he found out that no matter what they did legally, these people couldn't get asylum. And so he and a number of other churches got together and they started talking about the stories that we were now hearing at that point from our churches in El Salvador, who were verifying what these people were saying. And so these churches asked, "What are we going to do?" And they went back to Numbers 35. How many of you know Numbers 35? Anybody here? Numbers 35 is the cities of refuge. Is that a little more familiar? It's a prescription in the book of Numbers for what you do as the people of God when someone has committed a crime, but where the response to the crime is cruel and unusual. So in the case of Numbers 35, if someone had committed manslaughter, but they were being treated as if they had committed murder, the people of God were to give them a refuge. There were these special cities of refuge where they could stay until they could get a fair hearing. The cities of refuge were used by the Christians who protected the Jews who were fleeing Hitler. So the people who got together in Tucson said, it's time to recreate the cities of refuge. And they started the Central American Sanctuary Movement. The church that I belonged to in California was actually the second church in the country outside of Tucson that became a sanctuary church. So we actually had a refugee staying in our house. The sanctuary movement was successful. From 1982, when we started, it took from 1982 to 1990, By 1990, we won temporary protected status. Temporary protected status is a way of saying that a group of people who are fleeing what we know is a human rights crisis, if we have lots of evidence that they're fleeing a human rights crisis, they can come temporarily to the United States until either that crisis calms down or until they can prove, long process, right? To prove, you know, when you're running for your life, it's very hard to remember to bring all the papers that prove that you're running for your life, or even to get a hold of the proof. But they would be able to come and they would be able to be here temporarily for a period of time that would allow them to prepare an asylum case. So we won temporary protected status for people in El Salvador. By the way, there is no more temporary protected status except for white people from South Africa. That's a new group that the president designated. But all the others, when we talk about Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Haitians, they all had temporary protected status. None of them do now. But we won. There was no such thing as temporary protected status. We won it because of the sanctuary movement. By the way, we had 500 churches around the country who became sanctuaries before we were done. 500, all different denominations. The other thing that we did is we ended the funding going to the government of El Salvador. And the threat was always that if the funding ended, that El Salvador would become a communist country. El Salvador has never become a communist country. So the people who were running away weren't communists by and large, and that threat wasn't real. So what made us succeed? What was the magic bullet that gave the church that kind of power? It's because we stood up. We stood up and changed the narrative that people all over the country believed. The refugees staying with us stood up and told their stories, an enormous act of sacrifice and courage. And we stood up and said, we are going to protect them in the name of Numbers 35. And if you want to arrest us, you can. We did have a few people arrested, not many. By and large, the courts held that the freedom of religion allowed us to do what we were doing. But we took the risk because we weren't refugees, because we were citizens. And we stood up and said, our brothers and sisters from El Salvador are telling the truth. We know it from them, and we know it from the churches that we know there. So that's the first story. In 2005, a law passed the Congress, but not yet the Senate, called the Sensenbrenner Bill. Has anyone heard of the Sensenbrenner Bill? It would have made it a felony to be undocumented or to help or serve an undocumented person. So you couldn't give someone food, you couldn't give them medical care, you couldn't transport them, and we heard one legal interpretation that said you might not be able to baptize them. It had passed the House, but it had not yet passed the Senate. And so a number of us got together again and said, maybe it's time for the cities of refuge. But we said we have to do it differently this time, because the first time around, the solution wasn't easy, but it was simple. If we could have a fair application of the asylum laws, if we treated people the same way wherever they came from, if we could have temporary protected status to make the process a little bit more realistic, and if we could end the funding, we knew that we would stop the crisis. But at this point, in 2005, our immigration system was so badly broken, so ineffective, so illogical, so unjust, and so inhumane that we had people who were here with all kinds of different situations. And we knew that most of them had been here many years, and that living in a church was not at all what they were looking for. But we also knew that many of the reasons why people were in this situation, if any American actually understood the situation, they would say, that's right out of Kafka. That's crazy. So what we did is we asked immigrants with deportation orders with crazy stories to come forward and be willing to live in a church so that we could call in Numbers 35. These are people who often own their own homes, who paid taxes, who had their own businesses, but who chose to go live in a church and speak up and tell their story to try to help the average American understand. They got death threats. They couldn't leave. It was turned into house arrest for a number of them, but they did it in order for people to understand. And we didn't win. We didn't win immigration reform. It was way too complicated, and we have a larger problem that stops us from winning immigration reform, which if I have time, I'll tell you about. But we did change regulations. Our lawyer friend was talking about regulations. We changed 2 key regulations. And again, it took us about 9 years, but we changed 2 key regulations. One of them is we won the prioritization of enforcement. That means that if you were here with a crazy Kafkaesque story and you'd never committed a crime and you were supporting your family, you became a low priority for deportation. So you could come every year and you could check in and you could keep working on your case to try to solve it, and you could stay. That's called deferred deportation. I want you to remember that line because in my next story, it's going to become very important. So we won deferred deportation. That meant if you were a threat to public safety, if you were actually a violent felon, you were at the top of the list for deportation. And if you were in the situation of one of our students who was just deported at Fuller, who had been here for 35 years, had worked for her denomination for 20, had never committed a crime, had always supported her family, has grown children who are citizens, and who has grandchildren who are citizens. She was deported, by the way, recently in this mass deportation. That if you were her, you would become a low priority for deportation, and you could get deferred deportation. So we won that. The other thing we won was the sensitive locations regulation. That unless you were pursuing a violent felon, then all bets are off. If you're pursuing a violent felon, that's different. But other than that, immigration agents would not enter a church, would not enter a hospital, would not enter a court. So if you were going to court because you were a domestic violence victim, you would be able to testify without fear because your husband couldn't call immigration agents and have them go to the court and get you. That was called sensitive locations, churches, hospitals, courts. So we won those policies through standing up and standing together. So, going to go to a third story. In 2007, we had a bipartisan proposal for immigration reform, completely bipartisan. It was called McCain-Kennedy. And we really thought we were going to win. It was polling at 76%. And we lost. It didn't even get through the Senate. And we thought, how did it lose? And we realized that because the average American looked at what was in that proposal and realized that it would end us up with an effective, not open borders, an effective, sane, logical, and humane immigration system. And they said, sure, I'm for that. But it wasn't about them, and they didn't care. So they didn't call their senators or their congresspeople. Who called the senators and the congresspeople? At that point, the 20% of Americans who are anti-immigration, and they called all the time. And immigrants, of course, care, and their networks, but immigrants don't have any hope and don't feel like they have any power, and so they don't call either. So some of us, when it didn't pass, said, what is the one institution in our society that is mandated to care passionately about the well-being of people that are not us? What's the answer? The church, right? This is Sunday school, right? What is the one organization that is mandated to give people hope, even if they're hopeless, the church. So we decided that if the church, if immigrant and non-immigrant believers got together, that the non-immigrant believers would get passion because they knew that their brothers and sisters were being hurt. And that the immigrant believers would get hope because they knew that people were standing with them. And so we formed the Evangelical Immigration Table, which was at that point the largest cross-section of evangelicals that had ever gotten together on a social justice issue since the abolition of slavery. We had every major denomination. We had World Vision and World Relief. We had InterVarsity and Navigators. We had Focus on the Family. We went public in the Rayburn building of the Senate on July 12th, 2012. And on July 14th, President Obama declared DACA. How many of you have heard of DACA? A few, not everybody. DACA, remember I said about deferred action, which our student had. It's deferred action for a group of people. And the group of people are people who were brought here as very small children. They're often referred to as dreamers. And then they live their whole life. They go through the school system here. They graduate. They get jobs here. They have spouses, often who are American citizens. But they run into a problem. You're going to hear one of the Kafkaesque aspects of the immigration system. We have a little law that says if you've been here more than a year undocumented, and it can be proven, you have to go back to your home country for 10 years before you can apply. Now, these are people who have spent their lives here. It's very easy to prove they've been here more than a year undocumented, but they don't have anything back in that home country. Half the time, they don't even speak the language well, if at all. So deferred action for childhood arrivals is called DACA. Obama declared deferred action for childhood arrivals on June 14th, 2012. And he called us and he said, I could not have done this without the Evangelical Immigration Table because you're not Democrats. You're Democrats, Republicans, Greens, Libertarians, and you stood up morally and you gave me the support I needed to do this. There have been, I don't even know the total number of DACA recipients, somewhere around 1 million, right? How much? 800,000, but at one point it was the total. The highest total was almost 1 million. But I don't remember the exact number. But those are people who've been able to contribute. They were educated in this country. They have been able to turn around and give back. And they now have children. They now have been here for many years. They have careers. And by the way, there is no more DACA. So if they have not regularized their status in some other way, they are now all eligible for deportation. So, and we kept working, by the way, as the table. And in 2013, another bipartisan immigration reform proposal passed the Senate. But when we got to the House, there was a particular congressperson who stopped it from coming to the floor for a vote. We did have enough votes in the House to pass it. It would have ended us up with a effective, fair, just, and humane system. Not perfect, but a really wonderful compromise. And they didn't bring it to the floor for a vote, or we would have won it. They didn't bring it to the floor for a vote because the congressperson said to the Speaker of the House, this would not be good for us politically if we solve this problem. Let's not solve it. So I felt like Moses, looking into the promised land and knowing I would never enter, having spent a lifetime on this. But we didn't stop. So in 2016, by the way, by the time we passed it in the Senate, we had gone from 83% of evangelicals being against immigration reform to 72% being for immigration reform. We were at 72%. But when we couldn't solve the problem, when we couldn't end up with a fair and effective system, we lost ground, and we lost ground rapidly. And by the time we got to 2016, you know it was a signature issue on which Trump was elected. So Some of us at that point knew that we were in big trouble. We didn't know how big of trouble we were going to be in, but we knew we were in trouble. And so we started an organization. Our analysis was that one of the reasons why it was so hard to hold was because we had convinced leaders, but not congregations. And so Matthew 25, Mateo 25 was an effort to bring congregations together to accompany families facing separation through deportation. So many of these Kafka cases are mixed status families. And so we came together to walk with families as immigrant and non-immigrant churches working together. And that is still an ongoing effort. Now, I just want to say one more thing because I know I've taken more than my time. I want to talk about what's happening now, what the church is doing now to stand up. And I just want to talk about a little synopsis of what the church is doing now. First of all, the immigrant churches have grown up. In 1980, we had very few immigrant churches in this country. Now, the immigrant churches are the first responders. The immigrant churches are on the front lines, providing spiritual support, providing direct support, organizing legal support, providing information and training. We don't need the non-immigrant churches to rescue us, but we do need the non-immigrant churches to accompany us because that's all very expensive. And we need financial support, and we need people who are citizens and white citizens to take food to people who are shut in their houses. And we need people to document what ICE is doing, and we need public resistance, and we need prayer. So we need non-immigrant churches to come side by side with immigrant churches, not to do it all, just to walk with us. We need people desperately to reach across the divide to tell the story. We are a bitterly divided country. I don't need to tell you that. But what that means is that the stories that the lawyer was telling are not reaching the people on the other side of the line. And if they hear them, they don't believe them. And so it is critically important, particularly for Christians and particularly for white Christians, to really learn the truth about exactly what's happening so that you can tell the story because you have legitimacy, because you have the capacity to cross the line and tell the story and be heard. Because your average American, if they hear about injustice and they know it's injustice, they say, not in my country. But not enough people know that. So we desperately need people to educate yourselves, to have the direct experience. Don't believe me? Go out and talk to immigrant churches. And then stand up. Lastly, we need what we call relational advocacy, which is that we don't have any policies we can pass right now. But right now, precisely because we don't have policies that we can pass, we need average people who know what's going on and are willing to stand up in the name and spirit of Jesus to go and build a relationship with your legislator and talk about what you've learned and what you know, not what he's going to do, because he's not going to do anything right now. But our legislators are running scared. Our legislators are terrified. But perfect love casts out fear, and faith overcomes fear any day. But that comes from ministering to people. It comes from discipling them. It comes from encouraging. Encouraging means to give courage. We need you to get to know your legislators and to give them the courage so that when there's an opportunity, they'll stand. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I get to speak about what churches are doing right now, and I'm so grateful for the history, the rich history, and the inspiring history there is of the mark that the church has had in this country in the past. It's different times right now, right? It's not the 1980s, and it's difficult. In my role with FaithWorks, I get the privilege of leading a program that walks alongside churches as they decide to expand or start a new immigration ministry in their church. When this program was written, we did not know what we were against. We dreamed, you know, it was dreamt about, but we did not know what was going to be happening when the program was going to be executing. So I get to work with churches every day and have the conversations of what's the right thing to do at this moment, and this is what the church wants to do. But the most Sandy was asking me to talk about, so what are they doing right now? What are churches doing right now? We've heard Reverend Salvatierra talk about what the church has done. What I've seen with churches right now is we are in a response mode right now. That response mode we've usually seen in FaithWorks happen at the border mostly, right? That's where the flow of people was coming. So we've had partners for many years ministering in that response of, you know, feeding, clothing, sheltering, transportation. When people, you know, arrive at the border, they don't stay at the border, right? So transportation to the airport, to the bus station, that narrative has completely shifted in the past year. We are now in response mode, just right here where we are. Our neighbors are suffering. Our neighbors are being separated from their families, and that is where the church comes in. The churches in our network and just any other churches that we have networked with in the past year have taken on the work to really observe, to listen what is needed. Sometimes as churches, we have a passion for something and we have, you know, a high scale of talents, and we say, okay, well, we have a lot of teachers, so an ESL program is what we're going to do. That is, you know, that is where our strengths are. But what churches have done in the past year that I've had the privilege of experiencing is saying, hold on a second. We may have a lot of teachers. ESL might be our, you know, our strongest suit, but what does the community really need right now? So they've taken a step back to listen, to observe, and say, okay, this is what God is calling us to do. I get to lead churches as they decide, do we want to go a compassion ministry? Do we want to go in for a justice ministry and join brothers and sisters in, you know, like what they're doing in LA and praying outside and hosting those vigils? Do we want to do court, you know, accompaniment? What is it that we want to do? A lot of them have had to be very flexible because maybe they start the year thinking this is what our church is going to do, and then they've had to shift what they're going to do because that's what's happening. It has been moving from state to state. Right now it's in Minnesota. Where is it going to be tomorrow? That's what the church needs to be looking out for. And it may be stronger over there, but we still have brothers and sisters in our communities that are being separated. We still have people that are being detained. We still have children that get home and their parents are no longer there. So our churches have had a lot of flexibility and adaptability, but they have fully committed. A key that I've seen in the churches this year is when the entire church commits, they are committed, that's when they thrive in what they are doing. It's not just about one or two leaders in the church who are deciding to do this. It is about the entire church who is deciding to do this. And that has allowed them to really thrive and make a mark in their communities. Some churches are still focused on compassion, but guess what? Compassion has changed in the last year. You know, it's usually been emergency response, food pantries, clothing, shelter, and that is still needed. So don't get me wrong, we still need food, we still need shelter, we still need the clothing. But now our compassion ministries are taking a shift. Mental health is a big one right now. What are our brothers and sisters going through? What is the trauma that is happening in all of those kids' lives? What are the things that they are battling to? So the churches have listened, have paid attention. They are now serving to those mental health needs. They are now giving families a new sense of stability in the middle of everything, you know? When their lives are uncertain and they don't know if tomorrow someone's gonna knock on their door and say, you gotta go back, even though it's not safe, the most that we can do is give them a little bit of a normal life while we are with them. Churches are also standing up. They are outside of the courts. They are praying. They are accompanying. They are recording ICE. They are watching. There are, what is it called? Phone trees? No. Phone trees? Is that what it's called? When you know you have this system in place that everyone is calling one another. That is what is happening in the church right now. But I do echo what Reverend Salvatierra said. We need allies. Our churches need allies. The Latino church has been present for many years and is still present, but the Latino church is still afraid. What can we do? Will we get in trouble? Those questions are very real right now in our Latino communities. And that is where we extend the invitation. We need those allies that can amplify the voices that don't know how to get their stories out there. And how are they doing that? And how can you do that at your church? Preach through the immigrant lens. I encourage every church, do not get your immigration information from the news. Get it from the Bible. Jesus was an immigrant. And we've seen immigration, we've seen migration present in the scripture from the beginning. There are many texts in the Bible that I could go through that demonstrate us that migration is there. This is not political, it is theological. And that is where you can start as a congregation. This is a theological issue. What is our place as a congregation when it comes to walking alongside our brothers and sisters? Churches are preaching on immigration. They are reading books. They're getting educated. They're accompanying their brothers and sisters into court. They are providing mental health support, financial support, any resource that they can connect with. They are bringing in their justice and their compassion ministries into the culture of their church. That's a very important thing I tell all of the churches. This is not just one other ministry that we are doing. This is the life that we are living. It can't just be another charity case. And I'm sorry to throw out that word, but it cannot. It is not about us and them. It's about all of us together. That is what I get the privilege of seeing among our churches. But you know what? We still need more. So I invite you today, and I encourage you to think about it. What is our role in this day? What can we do to walk alongside other churches and our immigrant brothers and sisters in our communities? Thank you.
So we just walked through a little bit of like what is happening today, what has happened in the past. I'm gonna facilitate a couple of questions here for us, and to also allow you to ask each other questions as we go. But some of the things that I think I hear you, Cintia, saying we need more, and I hear you, Alexia, on saying like we need not just more, but a broad coalition of people. You talk about how DACA was won and how much the Evangelical Immigration Table played a role into that. But who also really played a role into bringing DACA forward were queer communities. We're communities of young folks who were coming forward and saying, the phrase was undocumented and unafraid, and they were saying this unafraid part of peace taken from the LGBTQ movement. And so it was a desire by many, many people. And so in this moment, we're in a really polarized society, and churches are no exception. Why and how do you work for these broad coalitions when there is so much distance between these groups?
So in the process, I'm just trying to remember which particular decade of the struggle. Those are basically all 4 decades we were in. But part of what we realized was that this wasn't an issue that could be solved rationally. There's a lot of good rational information, but when people are highly emotional, and the people who are wanting immigrants to leave this country are just as emotional as the people who are upset about what's happening. When an issue is highly emotional, you can't just sit across a table and talk about it. It doesn't work. So what we decided that we needed to do was to create common sacred ground that could connect immigrants and non-immigrants with each other in joint mission. So why is joint mission important? Is because if I go help an immigrant kid, but I'm helping the kid, I don't necessarily trust the kid. The kid is not my equal. The kid is not my peer. I feel for him, but I don't trust him. On the other hand, if I sit down with immigrant and non-immigrant pastors for a time of prayer, and we all share our pastoral concerns, the non-immigrant pastors begin to hear people just like them, people in ministry, and they begin to feel, oh, that person's pastor. Well, now I understand. We set up a project for people who were not pastors where we were visiting a children's detention center. And we were leaders in immigrant churches and leaders in non-immigrant churches, and we would go in pairs. Because what happened is while you were visiting that children's detention center, if a kid was deported, the non-immigrant member would say, what just happened? That's crazy. And the immigrant leader would say, that happened 3 times this week. And suddenly the non-immigrant begins to see it through the immigrant's eyes because they are equals. They are brother and sister in joint mission. And so you have to set up relationships that create that shift. And then people want to know the information. I mean, I don't know any of you out here, but I imagine that a number of you ended up here because you knew somebody, because you knew an immigrant, or because you heard the story of an immigrant that you believed. And then you say, what? So we have to create those contexts that break down the barrier from underneath by creating a common sacred ground that is above and beyond the barrier. You can't walk through that barrier. You can't hit your head on it. You've got to go underneath it. You've got to create relationships that bring it down in Christ. And so that's harder work and it takes more time, but it works.
And that's amazing. That's a great observation. But Dr. Salvatierra, what do you think of the fact that at this point it's not really that the law is just affecting immigrants, it's affecting U.S. citizens, and the erosion of our rights affects everyone, right? So it's not only your right to protest or your right to be safe in your home or the right to due process. It's affecting a particular population. It affects everyone. And then what's that? Forget the saying, at first they came for the socialists and I didn't say anything because I was a socialist. Then they came for the communists, it didn't say anything. And then eventually, they came for me. No one could speak up for me. What do you think of that as common ground? Something that we can all, as people living in the United States can point to our Constitution, our founding.
I don't know if any of you have friends that are anti-immigrant, but some of the folks that are anti-immigrant right now are shifting. They do see what you're saying, but some of them are digging in because the neurolinguist George Lakoff says that when people have invested in a paradigm, that they cling to it more and more tightly with evidence, no matter how much evidence comes in, until the evidence reaches a certain point, and then it suddenly breaks. And the person feels very disoriented, but there's a profound shift in their lives. So I do want to say that the Constitution isn't, for many of the people who are dug in, I had one of my immigrant pastors that I'm going to teach in a little while, who's MAGA, say to me, the president couldn't be intending this. He couldn't be intending it. It's somebody rogue below, because he's bought in, he's invested, right? So, and he does know, but he needs to be in relationship with someone like you, someone who knows the big picture, who can describe to him, this is the big picture, this is what's going on. Where I thought you were going that I actually want to respond to, I was a missionary in the Philippines for 3 years under the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. I was there for 1 million people running over the Chanks, nonviolently deposed the dictator. And part of what I learned there is that even when you don't have the traditional tools of democracy, if the people get together, we can still create change. And so I just want to underline that that some of the traditional tools of democracy are breaking down. But that doesn't mean we give up hope, because when people come together and raise our voices, that is another kind of miracle that occurs. It's just that there's a lot of people that I knew, a lot of friends who are pastors and leaders who died, but it's not fun. It's not pretty, but to be a Christian is to be willing to pick up the cross.
We're speaking a little bit about how that system of democracy is breaking down. We're speaking about the lawlessness that is there. And some believe like we're too late to stop it. Like the protections that we had is just too late to stop it. What are you seeing in the legal field, Jorge? You talked about these certain lawsuits. Are there particular ones that are coming to the forefront, are protecting some of those liberties that we had taken for granted, or that we assumed that because they were enshrined in the Constitution, we're going to be respected?
Wow. Okay, so it really does depend on the specific location where lawsuits are being presented. It also depends greatly or varies greatly from city to city. So, for example, in the Northern District of Texas, a lot of cases for writs of habeas are being denied. But just next door in the East District, they're being approved. And in El Paso, Austin, San Antonio, and the Western District, they're also being approved. So it varies greatly. And the issue is that there's not a consistent interpretation of these things, and it varies from case to case, to attorney to attorney, court to court. So what ends up happening is that, there's one set of law for one group and another for another. And often a lot of people just give up and they say, you know what, it's just not worth it. I'm going to go, I'm not going to fight. I just want a deportation order. As a matter of fact, that gentleman that you mentioned at the beginning, Mr. Luna, he was just waiting to be deported to Cuba when he was killed. So, there is hope. It's long. It's a long process, and we are seeing some good cases, but on the other hand, we're seeing nightmare cases, and it's very difficult, and very likely it's going to stay like this until the next Congress comes into power, if there's a change in Congress at all. And with that, I want to point out that, we are talking about legal problems, but at the end of the day, this is a political problem.
I do want to say that I've seen miracles come out of relational advocacy. I have seen people stand up. It is a discipling of your leaders if you visit them and talk to them as a brother or sister. 92% of them are Christians.
Yeah. And at the same time, when I think of Christians, I think what we hear out there is that the majority of both evangelical and mainline Christians voted for the current president, who ran on a very anti-immigrant platform, right? And so, in a sense, people feel like Christians have lost their credibility. Christians have, what do they have to speak into this? And so, how do you call those in? How do you call the witness of the church, if you would say, back into the picture? Do you want to start with that? Or just because you haven't spoken yet?
You can start. You can start. You can start.
So I would just say that the church, what did Jesus say? That the wheat and the weeds would grow up together side by side, and it wasn't our job to separate it. And that we live by grace, that it's not our job to judge. It's just our job to witness with our mouths and our lives. In Nazi Germany, good percentage of the church, in fact, the majority of the church supported Hitler. But there was a confessing church, and they were shining lights, and there were people who lost their lives to shelter Jews. So each of us has to answer to our own God, has to answer to God in our own way. And I think in the end, you can't be responsible for what other people do. You can only be responsible for what you do.
Right along with that, I think, this is an opportunity for the church, to stand up and say, well, I'm not perfect, but I'm ready to take a step forward, just being someone who works every day with churches who are being affected and with families who are being affected, hearing. And I know that it might not sound like a lot, like, well, what does it matter if they just say that, they repent and that they don't agree with it now? It does matter, to hear those words. It does matter to see the actions of this is not godly. And that is where I would tell the church to focus if they're trying to draw into this is, well, this is not godly. And who do I follow? Do I follow God or do I follow the government, right? Standing in the right side. I think that if Christ would give us another opportunity, let's take it, Let the church be the church and take a stand. I would encourage them to do that. I would encourage churches to do that, to stand on the side of Christ and in the heart of Christ.
Yeah, it's never too late.
Could you move closer to the mic, please?
Yes, it's never too late to turn back. Witnessing all of these atrocities and all that is happening across us can be depleting. And I'm wondering in particular, how have you seen immigrant communities find sustenance and hope?
This is not the first time that the immigrant community has been experiencing this. I mean, the immigrant community has been experiencing this for years now. It's just that it's more amplified right now. It's coming in stronger. There is this perseverance that the immigrant community has that I just honestly don't know how to even express it. Like, I cannot tell you. I've had people ask me, but why do you do what you do? I think it's rooted in love. Like, this is not about laws or, if you're to the left or to the right, or this is about real life. And I think that is where they get the strength. Like, this is their life. This is the life that they are living. This is their families. And seeing Christ in everyone that they serve, I think that's where we get the strength. It is depleting. It's exhausting. It is mentally exhausting to have to hear the stories one and another time and to be experiencing it yourself. But why do you do it? It's an act of love. It's life. It's like sort of when you have a job that you love so much and you say, you know, it doesn't even feel like work because I love it so much, you know, this is just my life. That's what it's like. Like, this is not just something else. This is something that we live through and we do it, and we just stop and take a deep breath and keep on going because we have to. Otherwise, we won't survive. That is what I've seen in immigrant churches, in the immigrant communities. Sometimes it honestly feels like there's not another choice. We just have to keep going.
I do want to say two things about that. And one is that the people who did save Jews in Germany, when they studied them, they said, "Why did you do this?" And they said, "There was no other choice." There's something about calling that always feels like that. And I do want to say that I am daily inspired by the faith of immigrant believers, that if you actually do work with them, you actually are benefited in the end yourself.
Well, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, both here and online. I know that there are folks online that may also have questions. And I don't know if you want to take one of these mics, Lizette, for those that have questions, just so that our audience online can also hear them. And yes, Jorge. Thank you. So I know that there's one here and then the gentleman in the back.
Where was the other one?
Hi, thank you for this great information, and history was not my strong suit in school, so thank you for breaking that down. So I work directly in the work on the secular side of things with refugee and immigrant children and their mental well-being and their language or English language acquisition. And my daughter is part of that work as well. The response from the church over the past few years over social issues has not only driven her away from church, but driven her away from God. And she now claims to be an atheist, and that aches my heart. She's also on the autism spectrum and is very black and white in her thinking. And so the history has been very important for me as I'm telling her, you know, this is not overnight. This is a process, and it likely will get worse before it gets better. And so Dr. Salvatierra, I hope I said your name correctly. It's looking like in these past movements, it's been like an 8 to 10 year movement. Is that what you're expecting in the current?
You know, it has been 8 to 10 years each time, you're right, before we were able to make real progress. So I don't know where to start counting this from. Because of course, the whole story is quite complex. What happened in the first Trump administration, what happened in the Biden administration, what's happening. It's a complicated story. It's not simple. We need a workshop, not presentations, to get through it all. But yeah, it's been about a decade each time until we were, and it was pretty bad. It's never been this. I have never experienced the loss of the rule of law. Everyone that I work with who came as a refugee is saying this feels familiar. And that's awful to me. I've never seen that. But the Sensenbrenner bill that would have made it a felony to potentially to baptize someone, that was pretty bad, right? And it was well on its way to passing. So I think we are, I'm hopeful that it will turn around. But, you know, it depends on us, whether we say yes to God or not. Just like it depended on Esther.
So thank you. So now I'm a lawyer also, and when it's more of a comment than a question, although I certainly would like to hear your input. Whether you're an immigrant or not, and whether there is an immigrant that is someone who is special to you in your life, if they don't have due process, neither do you. Due process either applies to everyone or it applies to no one, because due process is the way that you prove that you are here legally, or that you are a citizen, or that you are not a felon. And if they can arrest you, if ICE can arrest you, load you into a van, send you to a black concentration camp in Louisiana, and whisk you out of the country on a plane without a hearing, if they can do that to an undocumented immigrant, they can do that to an American citizen, because you as an American citizen wouldn't have the opportunity to prove that you are an American citizen. So when you're thinking about this, and when you are talking to other people about this, understand, again, due process applies to everyone, or it applies to no one. They can do exactly the same thing to you if they can do this to an undocumented immigrant. And once that is established, we are a police state. And so, push back as hard as you can on this, because your freedom depends on it as well, even if you're not an immigrant.
Go ahead. Do you want to read it?
What great comment. And for lawyers, it's easy for us to see, right? We're trained in the law and the Constitution. We have this sort of reverence for the law, and we understand this process. And when I'm talking to my lawyer friends, they're like, it's obvious, right? That's a big problem, and it's not a immigrant or non-immigrant issue. It's just, these are our rights, right? But that's why I asked that question. Does it resonate, right? Because we can't just direct the conversation to attorneys or people who are already sold on these principles, but rather to everyone. But yeah, no, great point. Thank you.
Head toward West Loden Street, then turn left.
With that.
A question from online. An administrator in a local public school district, what can they do aside from just listening and being compassionate?
There are a number of people. I don't know if I made it perfectly clear, but the sanctuary movement was a gray area legally. We had strong legal defense that we had a right to do what we were doing in terms of religious freedom. But it was, like I said, there were a few people that were arrested and one that was jailed. So, but when you have to take a risk, there are some gray areas now where people are taking risks because it's morally right. And they're trusting that, if, what does Maya Angelou say? If God and you are the ones in agreement, you're a majority. Is that I would say of public school teachers is there will be opportunities to walk into that gray area. There will be opportunities to shelter a child, to say to ICE not to come in, that ICE is not welcome in the building. It's a gray area. I mean, there are legal defenses for being able to say that, but there are also questions about it. But gray areas are often the areas where your moral choice matters most. So that's what I would say.
Yes, great point here. Here's some other ideas. Vote. I think this is a political issue. This is something important. And if it's something that really bothers you and this is something's going against your fate, vote like that and express that through your vote and express your viewpoints, right? I'm not saying, publish everything in social media and stuff, but do make your opinion clear and express your moral convictions onto this point.
I mean, I think I would say that there are ways to do like direct service as public administrators, like taking care of the families, like some very clear ways of like ensuring that people have food to eat, right? Like we can still do that. And then there will be the times of like in the actual school, is there a protocol for teachers? Is there protocols that they know how they will respond if ICE shows up at the school? Are there protocols for how they will engage or not engage, or who in the school engages with authorities? So that those kinds of things matter. Yeah.
Partner up too. I always say, I know the school system is a little tricky, what you can do with churches and what you can't, but this is your opportunity. You know, you don't have to do it alone. You can partner up, and in those gray areas, what you can to do directly in the school maybe can be done through a partnership, through those resources around in your community to provide wraparound services for the families and support them in any way that they might need.
Hi, my name is Corey for everybody on the live stream. I have a comment and a question. One of the comments, we talk about relational advocacy. Right now, some of our student leaders and some of our professors are visiting the Clear DFW prayer vigil that happens every Monday at the Dallas Processing Center from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. And what they are asking for is if you want to show up, if you want to volunteer as a clergy, that's always an option. But if you live in Dallas County or you know people in Dallas County, to contact your local commissioner, the commissioner's court, to tell them that you do not want the ICE center in Hutchins that they are building. So one way hyper locally that we can really stand up is contact those Dallas commissioners. That said, this is obviously a passion of a lot of our students and our professors here. And we are a very diverse student body. We are a justice-centered student body. So I was wondering from y'all, if you had a seminary close to you that could offer anything to the community, any classes, any support, what would you imagine that seminary or divinity school would offer?
I like those your expertise, because
Well,
here's an
as
academic
a-
dean
as
of
an
a
academic
seminary.
dean of a seminary. So we do have various educational programs. I'm leaving a little early tonight because I have to teach tonight my master's students, but we also have a professional certificate program in Spanish and English online on the response of the church to the migration crisis. And we have all kinds of folks who go through that. And you are also, of course, anybody here is interested, we can certainly get that information out. It's very inexpensive, and it goes through the much more detail about the legal situation, much more detail about trauma-informed care and how you can do that, much more detail about the Bible, much more detail about how you partner and who you can partner with. So we have a whole curriculum that we're going to be starting again in April or May. But definitely you can create educational resources for your community. And I'm really heartened by the number of people that are here tonight when the weather is not great, and people that are online who are taking their time, because I think there's a hunger right now to know. And really, I think tonight is a teaser, because this is so complicated that there is no way that we can give you all the information that you need to understand this issue. I just hope that it makes you want to understand it, to take the time to learn. Right, like Sandy said, the immigration system, I just realized I don't think you said it tonight, but the immigration system makes the DMV and the IRS look absolutely sane and easy in comparison. So do learn what's going on. And a seminary can create ways for people to learn that go beyond just a one evening.
And I would add to that, like seminarians often have to do practices. And so where you choose to practice, like where you choose to do your time, practicing among immigrant churches and getting to know those neighborhoods and the people, the community organizations that are around them. I think it's another way for seminarians to get some of that experience. Yes, there's another question.
Before, there's a question online that I wanted to read, and we may not have the time to go too much into detail, but if you can speak to this. The question is, what are your recommendations to simplify the citizenship process?
Okay, frankly, to that question, here's the thing. It's embarrassing that in the United States, we can't figure this out. 60 years ago, we were putting people on the moon. We do all these other complex operations, and we can't figure out a way of making sure that our rules and laws are respected while showing the best of us, remaining that shining city in the hill, and being a beacon of liberty and democracy around the world. Here's a few things. the quota system in place, and I don't want to go too deep into the weeds into this, but the quota system in place, it really creates this very long waits, 20, 30 years for some people. That is really ridiculous. These laws were thought of in the 1980s, implemented in the 1990s, and they haven't changed at all since then. Also, there was the internet didn't exist when they passed these laws. So we have this hodgepodge of regulations and laws and everything that doesn't really serve the people. I think that the immigration laws need to serve the American people. It should serve the economy. It should serve national security. And we should be flexible. We should have a way of saying, well, we have too many people right now, so we're going to stop it for a bit. But look, we might need some workers in Texas. We might not need more people in California, right? So we should be a little more flexible with that. There's great ideas. There's great projects and bills that have been introduced. But here's the secret. We know what the solutions are, and we have projects. What is lacking is the political willingness to resolve the issue. Yes.
I just want to give a little teeny example. Canada. Canada uses a computer program to estimate every year their labor needs for immigrants. And they adjust their quotas accordingly. That was one of the lines in the 2013 bipartisan proposal. Currently, our system has a flat limit for all unskilled labor of 10,000 visas a year. And since almost the beginning of this country, we have imported 70 to 80% of our agricultural workers. Slavery was a program to import agricultural workers. So we know that we need way more agricultural workers than we can bring in. And we have a computer system being used just north of the United States, and we don't use it.
Here's the other big one. We need to get rid of those bars that prohibit people from leaving the United States and coming back. Those were ill-conceived ideas. And what has happened is that instead of having migrant workers coming to the United States who work for seasons, now we have entire families wanting to come and work in the United States and stay in the United States to be together with their families, right? So we need to get rid of things that do not work. We need to use technology to put in place a system that works for everybody. And then, make sure that it's working for all of society, not just for political reasons. Thank you.
Is that all? There was another question.
Right here, center.
Well, not exactly a question, it's sort of a comment in terms of,
I think the people who really bought into the anti-immigrants philosophy that's in this administration been introduced, a lot was because they was sold this whole thing about all these horrible criminals that were bringing all this crime. And I just wondered, statistically, I would love to know what the statistics are, whether it be by states, by region, or by our country. It seems to me that it's probably a very small percentage of people that are actual criminals that somehow got here. And that if a lot of people were to be able to see these statistics on a regular basis, like, they were every night on the news in the newspaper, well, Texas is now only has 12% criminals being X'd out or whatever. It would help people to understand, I think, a little bit better, because the whole thing was we're getting rid of all these criminals. That don't exist.
Great point. And based on government statistics right now, and I don't know how reliable they are, but based on the HS numbers, only 5% of the people who are actually been deported have criminal records. And of those, just a very tiny minority are violent criminals. So, and to the point that you're making, And we've known this for over a century since we started tracking this. Immigrants commit fewer crimes than native-born citizens. That's a reality. And the thing is that they're a lot easier to scapegoat because they don't vote, they are, not really politically represented, and they can't really speak up for themselves. So it has happened in other countries through our history. Here's one point though that we do need to recognize and with open eyes. The border policies of the Biden administration contributed to what we're seeing right now. I'm not saying that this is better. This is absolutely not. This is the opposite of what should be done. But we can do both things. We can secure the border. We can have an orderly system and still be compassionate and still respect our laws and rules. And I think it's important that when we're looking for the solutions and getting people together, we make that distinction. That's not really, that it's not that we're in favor of criminals. Of course not. No, nobody's going to defend a criminal, period. Often I would come up, they were family members are going, well, a loved one got caught with, 40 pounds of cocaine in the truck. It's like, sorry, I can't help you. There's nobody's going to help you with that. Or murder, nobody's going to help you with that, period. The law doesn't allow for that. Nobody's defending that. What we need to be clear is that, the tias, people selling or, selling tamales, doing the agricultural work, even if you come without authorization to the United States, you're still owed due process. We are a country of immigrants. That's part of who we are as a country. And to the point that Reverend Salvatierra was saying, we've always relied on immigrant labor.
And I would add to that, immigrants are vulnerable to crime. When you come into a country and don't speak the language, when you don't know what your rights are, immigrants can be very vulnerable to crime. And for those that are seeking to adjust their status, that are seeking to be a part of a regular immigration process, like it doesn't help you to get involved in crimes. Like, that's one of the things that you have to prove your good moral character. So there's even programs in the US that are created, are U visas for victims of crime, because there are so many immigrants that are victims of crime here in the US.
I do want to say that the overall statistic for people that are repeat offenders is 0.3% of the country, and immigrants, I think it's 0.15. There's a statistic of 14% that includes all federal crimes, but they're including in that anybody who crossed the border without authorization. So which is not a crime, it's a civil offense, but they include it in that figure. So with all of the people who just crossed the border without full documentation included, it only goes up to 14%. So it's a very low percentage.
So that's something I wanted to say about this is the question we should ask is, so who is defining who a criminal is, because we might think, okay, well, it's the person who does this and this, but right now, just anyone who crossed the border can be a criminal. So I think that's a good question for us to pose ourselves when we're seeing the news, right? And hearing the stats. Okay, who is defining, who's a criminal? Because we just keep hearing it over and over that it's only the criminals, right?
We have time for one more question and then we'll be wrapping up.
Hi. So earlier, we were talking about hope and resilience and how we can have hope today because of the work and the strength of all different groups that came together to enforce policies that benefited communities and things like that. And of course, today we want to maintain that hope. We want to keep that hope going. But also, we are saying what is real, that things look so different today. Things feel so different today. And so I wonder, in each of y'all's context, how do y'all obviously create hope and foster resilience while also centering grief and lamenting with the people that you serve and work alongside? How do, in your context and in your work, how do y'all balance the two?
I think hope and grief go hand in hand. Like hope is for the hopeless, right? Like the hopeful don't need hope, they have hope. I think that two things that have been already said, like for some people, like there is no choice, right? But to have hope. There is no choice but to believe that things will get better. Some of it for me, and for what I've seen in my context, is that when I see people taking action together and when I am there taking action together, that I get hope, because I realize like we're not alone. Like there are another 100 people that are standing here speaking against this, or there are a lot more people in here that care about this or that are saying no, or and so in DC, one of the things that we have been doing as a community is that at 8 p.m., people come out and they bang pots just to remind people that we are joyful, that we're not going to let us down. And so I think often those small practices of we are called to do what we can, even though, like, I think one of the questions that I had here was like every generation, like Dr. Alexia Salvatierra was like, every generation had their own fight. Every generation had like their own struggle. And here we are having another struggle. And so it seems like, will the struggles end, or what do we do with that? I don't have an answer for that, I think, but what we're called to do is to be a light, right? Like, how do I keep this little light alive for this season so that at least this person that's in front of me has a better outcome? And so being together, small practices, and not being afraid of the pain and the grief, because I think they go hand in hand.
Can I say something? There's this new book by Kat Armas called Liturgies for Resisting the Empire. And she starts her book with a story of a hummingbird in a forest. The hummingbird is with all these animals, and the forest is burning up. And all of the animals are saying to each other, like, well, what can we do? Like, we can't do anything to put this fire out. And then they see that the hummingbird is running to the river and getting as much water as it can and throwing the water. And they're looking at the hummingbird like what is he doing? And then they asked the hummingbird, like, why did you do that? And then the hummingbird said, well, I had to try at least, I had to do something. So the hummingbird knew, I'm not going to be able to put out this fire by myself, but I at least can do what I can within my limitations and within my strength. We always love to use Philippians 4:13 as this verse of we can do all things, people wearing, workout t-shirts and all of this, but the truth is what Paul is saying there is you can do all things within your context, within your capabilities. He was in prison when he was saying, we can do all things in Christ. And what could he do from prison? He could just do whatever he could do being in prison. So you can do whatever you can do within your context, within your capabilities and strength. And those small little things, like Sandy was saying,
Well, it shows that it's back.
That speaks to your life, and that maybe there is some, even if you're just a it feels hopeless sometimes, but I do believe that together we really can.